So talk to me. Why would this is a question that, how do I put? It's not obvious that somebody would collect old stuff, right? Like, so what? Why should someone be a collector? Like let's start from scratch.
I can tell you because I've actually, as I've done my TikTok channel, I put a lot of thought into that question about
Mhm.
what it is about that draws me to collecting, and I think the answer that I've come up with is that to me, collecting is an anthropological expedition. It
Mm.
allows me to understand what it was like to live on the plains of Wyoming in the 1920s versus the 1870s versus the 1850s, or understand what the motivations were behind somebody that lived inside of a big city in the 1930s. It allows me to put myself in somebody else's place because it's completely unfiltered history. It is something that was physically there and in their hands and the way that it was used. And so it gets rid of the narrative that you receive in any textbook, no matter what it is that they're looking at the types of items that I collect in order to write histories. And so the more that I can expose myself directly to those items, the better I understand. And so I think the fascination with collecting for me is that I gain deeper understandings of humanity and the way people work and what their motivations are, and a deeper understanding of why things happen. Because so often with those narratives of history, we say, well, this happened because of this. And that's almost never true. There's almost always there are 40,000 things that influenced one thing to happen. And the deeper you can immerse yourself in the actual items that existed and were around them and that they were exposed to and that were influencing them, whether it be advertising or postal history, whatever the case may be, I think it gives you a deeper anthropological intimacy with our forefathers and with everybody that came before us. And it's allowed me, I mean, I live way out isolated in Western Wyoming. So like trying to understand the universe of somebody that's grown up in the inner city of Chicago is something that's extraordinarily difficult to do because I have no frame of reference for it. But through items, I feel like it gives me an opportunity to at least get some small pictures into that life.
Mm. I grew up on the north side of Chicago in the city, but I
Did
wouldn't
you?
call it the inner city.
I think
Um,
you would agree that I have no idea what that life is about growing
so,
up in
so it's really
Wyoming.
interesting. I lived almost my entire life in apartment buildings.
Mhm.
And when I moved into a house 4 years ago, it was like, wow, this is like a completely different way of living. Right? You don't
Mhm.
hear, if you hear something moving upstairs, it's rats, not the neighbor's kid who's, jumping around and playing.
Yeah,
Right?
yes.
It's just like it's a different kind of way of living for sure.
Mhm.
Wow, so interesting stuff. All right, so you mentioned the blockade. So I was looking here and I found it. So I discussed this in a podcast I did with Michael Cochin a few years ago, and it's called. We'll put up a link to it on the page. So that it's called Jewish Freedom in America. But we discussed this letter. It was written. In fact, I'm going to share my screen here. This is JSTOR, where a scholarly article was written about it. So it was a letter of Jonas Phillips dated July 28th, 1776. And
Okay.
it was written to a Jew named Gumpel Samson and was written in what we call today Yiddish. When this was published
Okay.
back then, it was called Judeo-German, meaning it was
Okay.
published in 1894.
Okay.
Uh, and it's a letter in which he describes or he mentions the American Revolution. And the
Hmm.
letter today is in England because it was, or in the United Kingdom, because it says here it was intercepted by the British, right?
Yes.
So here we have an actual letter that somebody wrote.
Yes.
So that's maybe an example of philatelic history.
Yeah.
Um,
And I tell you what, actually, what I can do is I believe I know a website where there's a link to that entire collection display. I mean, you should see the display on postal history. The folks that I mean, they put
you'll give me the link
scrapbooking.
and we'll put it up on the page on nehemiaswall.com.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is that I can show you specific examples of those because
Mm,
because the scholarship he did on that, and there are thousands and thousands of exhibits like that where people have gone to incredible depths to find information and uncover new truths about history that's done
mm.
in just my field, much less every other collecting field.
Yeah. So what's interesting about this letter is number one, here's information about the American Civil War or excuse me, the American War of Independence or Revolutionary War,
Yeah.
that we normally wouldn't think about, right? It's from a Jew in the colonies, or now the nascent United States, who's writing not in English, but because he's writing to another Jew, he's writing in his native language, or language he knows at least, which is Yiddish, which is,
Yes.
like I said, they call it Judeo-German because it's German written in Hebrew characters, but with lots of Hebrew and Slavic words, right? So it's not exactly German. Um, so yeah, and then we only have that letter. So this is another interesting point. This is not a letter that was meant to be preserved, right? So you
No.
used that word when I was talking to you on the phone about things, ephemera, right? This
Yes.
was ephemeral. It was not meant to be. Tell
Yes.
us what ephemera are.
Ephemera simply means something that had a utility that was meant to be discarded, and generally it's referred to with paper. But ephemera is exactly what I collect, and the reason that I collect ephemera, whether it be letters or small magazines or whatever
That's
the
a
case
big
may
word.
be.
Tell us what ephemeral is, and what does that mean in plain English?
Ephemeral just means fleeting. It means it's here and it's gone. The whole idea is that it's not supposed to be preserved. And in my opinion, ephemeral material is much more honest than any other material, because it was designed to be used for a specific purpose at that point in time and then to go away. Whereas even with things like journals and diaries, when folks write those, they often write them with a view towards posterity and pushing forward a narrative. But when you have a private letter between two people that is supposed to be discarded, that was never intended for consumption anywhere else, I believe you get a much more honest viewpoint. And the fact that you found a letter written in Hebrew during the revolution is fascinating. I think that's one of the most interesting things about getting into collecting. Is one of my favorite items that I have is a letter that's from Kemmerer, Wyoming in 1900, and it's all done in Chinese because there were a lot of
Wow.
Chinese laborers here.
Wow.
And it's really important to remember that history is not, we say this is the way people were, but that's not the way people were. People are the same way they are now, where everybody's different and everybody has opinions and everybody has a different experience. You and I will both, do this interview, but your experience of it and my experience are going to be different. And only by taking a look at those many different viewpoints, because I'm sure that a Hebrew's impression of America during 1776 or 78 or whenever that was written is probably very different than many of the Englishmen or the Americans that may have stood on the same exact ground that they did. And to me, that's real history. And that's what really attracts me, is it gives you that depth of understanding that you really can't get any other way, because it's just too much to put in a book. You have to condense in order to be able to write that narrative. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's always more complicated than it seems in books. And collecting lets you look at that complication.